All right, good afternoon, Year 9. Just wanted to run through some of the questions that I set you. I wanted to go through both questions, both the 4 mark question and the 8 mark question, and I'll hopefully give you a bit of support when writing it if you haven't already written it, or you can take a look at it and think about how you might use my feedback to make your answers better. So obviously we're going to start with question number 1, and question number 1 is describe the racial tensions present in post-war America. Now, as a 4 mark answer, all it's really asking you is to make points. So describe literally means what do you know? Okay, so just describe what you can see, what racial tensions you can see in post-war America. So what is the situation for African Americans living in America? So I've given you a list of things to include. These are all things that could be could give your answer a lot of structure, which is good. So what to include? In the early 1900s, the Jim Crow laws in the southern states of the USA meant that white and black people were segregated from each other. Now, although it's different from state to state, this is the segregation on the buses. This is the segregation in public spaces like water fountains, bus stops. So by mentioning the Jim Crow laws specifically instead of just segregation, then you actually get you'd get more marks from the examiner. Okay, so black and white people had separate sections of the buses and restaurants that they were allowed to sit in, and even different churches they could attend. Again, that's Jim Crow laws. They were also not allowed to vote, and they didn't have the same equal standard of education as white people. So we have discrimination in education. We have white schools that get huge amounts of government funding, and we have schools predominantly for African Americans that receive very little funding. The teaching isn't as good, the textbooks aren't as good, and that means that the results aren't as good, and that limits the ability to go on to further education, universities. They also didn't have the right to vote, which is very important. If you can't vote, then the government has no interest in keeping you happy because it's not relying on your vote, so it doesn't need to make things or make decisions that affect you positively. Many white people in the southern states were racist against black people, and they didn't feel as though they should have equal rights. So again, there's just this ingrained racism, especially in the South. The southern states, remember, were the kind of hub of slavery in the South. Oh, sorry, in America. Even though slavery had ended in 1863, many white people continued to discriminate against black people and treated them badly. So again, they've gone through this kind of long experience, but I mean, 1863, we're looking at 1945, almost 100 years later, and some of the same ideas and thinking have gone into place. So a good 4 mark answer should be including as many facts as you can, but remembering that it's just a 4 mark question and that you shouldn't be writing too much, okay? So including some of those facts and developing them a bit further would get you a more of a mark. And just to be clear, if you just wrote one of those bullet points, if you wrote the first bullet point, for example, that would get you 1 mark. But if you combined it with the second, that would give you 2 marks because you've developed the segregation. You've actually, you've said what kind of segregation there is. And then, for example, if you talked about the education, you could then elaborate like I did just a minute ago about the different schools, and that will give you 2 marks. So just 1 mark is for establishing something, making a point. A second mark comes for kind of giving a bit more detail. So in total, we're looking for 2 developed points. Let's see how some of you have done. So I've just selected a kind of a random selection of boys who have submitted answers to me. We're just going to go through what they've written, and we're going to kind of have a think about how they've done. So, as I said before, you don't need to write too much for this. This is probably a 1 paragraph question. You should spend about 5 minutes on it. So the first person has written the racial tensions present in America were segregated between white and blacks. Black people and white people were very different from each other at the time. When a black person was sitting on a bus, they had to stand up for a white person as they wouldn't be any more room on the bus. This shows discrimination, as it's quite unfair to do this. Again, that's a mark because he's established that there's a difference between sitting on a bus. If you'd mentioned Jim Crow laws, that would be a developed point, so that's 1 mark. Black and white children were also separated from from each other as they went to different schools, as the white schools were posher and cleaner than the black schools. Again, using words like posher, you've got to explain what that means. The teachers that worked in black schools barely got paid in comparison to the teachers in white schools, as got paid a lot. There were also race riots between the whites and blacks. One of the violent racial conflicts was in Chicago race riot, which started in July 1919. Multiple blacks and whites died from this. The term slavery ended in 1863. However, the whites were still treated very poorly when Martin Luther King did his civil rights movement, and racism went down a little bit. There is still racial behaviour today in society, but not as much as the past. So straight away, this is kind of unnecessary. We don't need to include this because it's nothing to do with pre-existing racial tension. The Chicago race riot is a piece of specific information, which is good, but it's not really linked to the point that we're trying to make, what the pre-existing racism is. So although he's hit some really good areas, he hasn't developed them enough. So I'd say this is between 2 and 3 marks. Let's have a look at the second one. So the second one is obviously, the first one was too much because you don't need to write that much. But the second one is just too little. It's only 2 sentences. It says racial tension in post-war America were high as civil rights movement started up and planned a march on Washington. The women's movement also started to free women. So straight away, anything to do with the women, unfortunately in this question, is not relevant. There's no need to talk about the women's movement. The question is, describe racial tensions present in post-war America. And the second one, talking about the March on Washington, again, that's not answering the question, so you wouldn't get any marks for that. So the only thing there is that the civil rights movement started, so that might pick up a mark depending on the examiner. But you need to be focused on what the question is asking you, which is post-war racial tensions, Jim Crow laws, segregation, racism, anything along those lines. But if you're talking about the civil rights movement and any of their actions, that happens. That's not pre-existing. That's what's happening in post-war America. So a nice little, a nice little bit of feedback on that question. Let's move on to the second question. So the second question is all about explain the importance of the NAACP on the civil rights movement. On the civil rights movement. So what to include? So what I've said is anything to do with the NAACP. Explain the importance of the NAACP on the civil rights movement. That should just be that. Let's just change that very quickly. So this is an 8-mark question, so it means you need to take 2 points and you need to develop them. Okay, so you need to have 2 paragraphs here. So what would I include? I would say that the NAACP, the most important thing they did was that they brought people together in the aim of achieving a cause, which is civil rights. Okay, so if people believed in civil rights, they could go to one body and they could all join together and they could campaign for it. So it's actually a unifying group. It brings people together. And that's shown during the war as membership increased from 50,000 people to 200,000 people. So if you're campaigning yourself, that's one person. If you get your friends, maybe that's 10, 20 people, your family. But if you can get a whole movement of people, then the government is going to listen to you. So the NAACP became a real body that the government would have to listen to. It also gave the civil rights movement clear directions, focusing on education, voter registration, and employment. Okay, so they wanted the vote, they wanted to end segregation in schools, and they wanted to end segregation in employment and discrimination in employment. So what else would I talk about? I talk about the key achievements that we've looked at so far, which are Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which ended segregation in schools, or it declared segregation in schools as unconstitutional, which would then allow for other schools to start desegregating. And the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955, we all know Rosa Parks refused to move on a bus and was arrested, and that sparked this boycott. But, there's a lot more planning that went into it. The NAACP was the group that kept that movement going. It lasted over a year because the NAACP were able to coordinate people. They still had to get to work. They were still helping move them around the city of Montgomery and getting them to where they needed to be. And that ended with segregation on buses being declared as unconstitutional. So they were very, they achieved a lot with that. Let's have a look at this question. So again, 2 paragraphs, both explaining reasons why the NAACP is important to the civil rights movement. We need to make sure we're linking back to the question. So structure, make a point, use some examples, and then explain, link it back to the question. So, the NAACP is important because, I know this because, add all the facts you can think of. This is important because, linking it back to that question. So again, those are the sentence starters we should be thinking about. Let's have a look at how some of us got on. So the NAACP played a major role in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. One of the organization's key victories was the US Supreme Court 1954 decision in Brown versus Board of Education that outlawed segregation in public schools. Again, that is an excellent point to have made. Okay, they've made a really clear point. That's starting of an excellent answer. But what they do is they then move on to equal rights, racial prejudice. Okay, this is the point where you need to kind of explain why this is important. This is important because this was important because you've got to be developing your answer further. That's just one statement. You've got to develop it with some facts that you already have. So let's see how they got on. The National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People promised to champion equal rights and eliminate racial prejudice and to advance the interest of coloured people regarding voting for rights, legal justice, and educational and employment opportunities. So again, how did they do this? They did this by and explain, give facts. What did they do? You could talk about the Montgomery bus boycott. You could talk about how they organized people. Okay, so again, you've made 2 really clear points, really good developed points, but you need to be able to add information to them and argue it, because at the moment they just stand as 2 points. So have a look at the second one. Okay, so the NAACP was extremely important for the civil rights movement because they helped outlaw segregation in public schools and were trying to abolish racism and discrimination throughout America. Excellent. Again, you've made a point. You need to support it. You've made a point about public schools. Why not talk about Brown versus Board of Education? Why not give the date? Why not explain what that did? The NAACP was also important for the civil rights movement because they had the same goal of equal rights and no discrimination, so they worked together to force the government to listen. Okay, yes, they did force the government to listen, but can you think of an example? How about the Montgomery bus boycott? How about talking about how the Montgomery bus boycott showed that they were going to stand up against the local government, and they were successful? So both of these points that have been made, they need to be developed further. They need to have more information included. Let's have a look at our last one. I appreciate that I've been talking for a while, so this is our last one. So one reason why the NAACP was important is because it helped decrease the segregation in educating system. Excellent point, well made. Now what I'd be looking for next is a comment about Brown versus Board of Education, and what I get is this starting sentence. This is exactly how you should do it. Unfortunately, what comes next is not the developed point I'm looking for, but this person has clearly stated, I know this because. This shows the examiner that they're about to kind of drop a whole load of information on them that, the exam hasn't given them. So I know this because the NAACP looked for well-educated teachers and took them to black schools to teach. What I need there is I need Brown versus Board of Education. I need more information about that. But then we have this comment as well. This meant that. This meant that. This is a link back to the question. This is you explaining your point. Okay? So although the points aren't as factually correct as I'd like, the structure of this is really good. Okay? So the structure of this, he's made a point, he's then added some information to support it, and then he's linked back to the question. All right, so although the information it needs to be more factually correct, he has used the structure necessary, okay? And exactly the same thing has happened on this second one. So let's have a look at this second answer. I know this because, okay? And then, so the idea is the structure is there, the information is just lacking. So more revision, using the work that I've asked you to complete, and putting it in this. I need to see facts. When you write, I know this because I need to have more information to read. Okay, I need to have it more specific to what we're learning. All right, boys. I just wanted to thank everyone. If you submitted me work this week, it's really good to keep active. I hope everyone is well. I hope everyone is healthy, and I look forward to your responses this week. Okay, so enjoy your week, and good luck with the rest of your work. Thank you, boys.